What is up, my homies? Welcome to another OmniFocus Fitness video. Today we will be discussing caffeine and performance. How do they mix? How do they relate? Does caffeine have an impact on performance in two specific areas: resistance training and aerobic or endurance training? Let's get started, shall we? Okay, let's get started with the resistance training aspect of caffeine and performance. Research is very shaky when it comes to looking at resistance training and caffeine. There isn't a whole lot of research out there, but the research that is out there is not very conclusive. Really, if you were to really look at it, it'd probably tend towards there isn't that much of a relationship between caffeine and performance as it relates to resistance training. However, there are a few areas where caffeine might have a very small impact, and those areas would be something like the rating of perceived exertion and the perceived pain intensity. So there's two different measures on how to figure out how exhaustive the exercise is, to put it very simply. And in those areas, it was perceived that training could be sustained for just a little bit longer because of the blunting effects that caffeine has, which is actually something that we'll see more of in the aerobic training section. But for the resistance training section, it is possible that caffeine has a very small blunting effect on RPE scale and the PPI scale. Now, another thing that it does is the research that I've looked at has shown that an increase in repetitions can also be claimed to caffeine. So maybe an increase of maybe 1 repetition. We're not talking about like 5 repetitions or anything like that. And it's really just 1 repetition. And really, am I going to say that caffeine necessarily has a massive impact on your muscle? I wouldn't say that. I would probably go and venture a guess that because your RPE is lower and your PPI is lower, that has such an impact on performance that you're able to then squeeze out that extra rep, because it's not so much muscular failure that usually stops us during exercise, but usually because our brain is telling us, okay, you need to stop now because this is it. So maybe if caffeine has a blunting effect on that, then you're able to squeeze out that extra rep. Other areas that people have looked at is the one rep maximum. Okay, 1 rep maximum. And in that respect, I believe there was maybe like a 2.7% increase. Nothing that is really going to make a difference in the real world situation. So, and even that is probably kind of doubtful. We probably need a lot more research on that. So for the time being, in short, we will say that caffeine has a very minimal impact on resistance training, and that impact, wherever it is seen in some sort of conclusive way, is more towards the perceived exertion as opposed to actual physiological effects on the muscles themselves. Basta! Okay, moving on to the aerobic side, the endurance training, etc., for you runners, marathoners, blah, 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 blah. You people out there that like to just go very long distances for very long periods of time. Caffeine actually has a significant impact on performance. Would you believe it? So there were a few studies that looked at the impact that caffeine has on performance in several different areas, from like swimming, running, aerobic capacity compared to anaerobic capacity, things like that. And they actually found that caffeine can have up to about a 20% increase in performance in aerobic capacity. So this particular study that I'm talking about, which is again linked in the website below, is my article, and it's got all the details with all the studies, all the sources, so you can just look at that. But the particular study that I'm looking at, that I'm talking about here, is a study that looked at people that went through aerobic training at, I believe it was 80% of their VO2. So they were at a steady state of exertion compared to people that were also at 80% VO2. So again, steady state exertion, same, it's equated for. And one group had caffeine and the other group did not have caffeine. The group that did have caffeine were able to sustain that same intensity for about 20% longer than the group that did not have caffeine. So that's a pretty substantial amount, and that could definitely make a difference when you're doing some sort of long distance race. So yes, caffeine does have a significant impact on performance when it comes to aerobic capacity. However, let's look at that. There were several theories as to why. And the why comes down to three things. Two things that they talk about, and one thing that I briefly mentioned in the last section. One is caffeine seems to have an impact on glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen. So when you're exercising, you're breaking down glycogen to fuel your workouts. Well, caffeine apparently blunts that system and actually increases the second reason, which is fat oxidation. So while your glycogen levels are being broken down at a slower rate, your fat oxidation is making up for that. And it's possible because you're below the anaerobic threshold. So that actually has a pretty profound impact, because if your glycogen stores run out later than a person who doesn't take caffeine, and then you substitute that with fat, which your body has an abundance of, even if you're pretty lean, you're still going to have much more fat than on you from a caloric advantage than in respect to glycogen, to your glycogen stores. So those are two reasons as to why caffeine has, or the idea as to why caffeine has an impact on aerobic performance. Now, that being said, I would venture to say that a blunting in RPE, because this is another thing that they found in aerobic training, is a blunting in the rating of perceived exertion. So if you blunt that, then that will kind of allow your body to push itself a little further without your mind necessarily getting in the way of doing so. So I feel like that's probably a little bit less of a factor, but I think it's still worthy of mention. And finally, what's really important, I'm telling you all this information, but it doesn't really help you if you don't know how much caffeine is going to help. Taking a very small amount of caffeine might not do anything. A very large amount of caffeine might kill you. So I'm just saying that it depends on the dose. And most of the studies that I looked at saw a significant increase, or a significant impact on performance with 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So they used that measure and they saw a increase in performance. Do I know if a little bit less could maybe give you the same effect? I don't know. There were a few studies that used a little bit less. I believe maybe 2.5 to 3.5 milligrams per kilogram. I'm not 100% certain on that. But 6 milligrams per kilogram is a pretty good starting point, or really a good point in general. I believe that equates, and this is definitely going to change from person to person, but I believe that equates to a roughly 2.5 cups of coffee. I'm hoping I'm not wrong with that, but it's going to be somewhere in that realm, so pretty doable. So there you have it, your dosage, 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and definitely do your own research on that just to make sure that you're on the same page. Okay, so in review, caffeine and resistance training. Very small impact, if any. The impact is more towards perceived exertion, which then, in my estimation, leads to an increase of maybe 1 repetition in certain exercises. Has almost no impact on power output, so 1 rep max will not be significantly impacted. As far as aerobic training and caffeine, there can be up to depending on which sport you're using and nutrition and all kinds of other factors, it can be up to a 20% increase in performance from caffeine, which is a substantial increase from if you're doing long-term endurance type exercise. And as far as the dosage for both, we're going to be talking about, based on the studies that I've seen, which it could be a little bit less. I don't know that for a fact, but based on the studies that I've seen, we're talking about roughly 6 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine to body weight ratio. I guess I'll see you in the next video. See ya! Hey, thanks for watching. If you'd like to know more details or look at my sources, check out OmnifocusFitness.com. Link below. There I cover everything in greater detail and fidelity. I'm a one-man operation dedicated to educating myself and others through scientific study. As such, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed, liked, and shared the video to spread the knowledge. The content will remain free. Cheers, and see you in the next one.